Okay, ladies, you know Acts, what we've done in Acts. I mean, we've got it in Jerusalem. We had the gospel preached in Jerusalem. We had the gospel preached in Samaria, Judea and Samaria, and now we're into the end of the world. And we've talked about how Luke, the writer, has established certain things right from the beginning, that as the gospel is communicated, it's communicated through, what are some of the ways the gospel is communicated? How is that? How is it shared? How do people become aware of the gospel? According to what Luke writes here.
The disciples and apostles that traveled.
Okay, disciples and apostles travel. And when they're traveling, what are some of the things they do as they travel that communicate?
They do miracles.
Okay, good. They do, as they travel around, they do miracles. We saw Peter do a lot of miracles in Jerusalem. When his focus on Jerusalem, he did a lot of miracles there. And what else do they tend to do? Teach, yeah. Teach and preach. They do a lot of teaching and preaching. And that's the way it seems to be conveyed, which is the same thing that Jesus also did. You know, he taught and he preached and he performed miracles. So what they're doing is the same thing that he did. And so Peter did it in Jerusalem. We had Philip do it in Judea and Samaria, and then Peter, because Peter seems to be involved in all these transitions, then he does it. And as we're right at the threshold of the gospel going outside of the Jewish people, outside of Palestine, Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, we're starting to this ends of the earth. And we know who's going to do it. Who's going to take the gospel to the ends of the earth? Paul's going to do it. And Paul has that interesting background that you can look at and say, well, only God could do it. You know, so it's not a matter of Paul came to an awareness that he was wrong. You know, that's not how Paul's life changed. Paul's life changed because, why did Paul's life change?
He saw Jesus.
He saw Jesus. Boom, God intervened. So you can't look at him and say, well, you know, maybe he was wrong, or, you know, what did he study? That it's not intellectual growth. Luke wants to say God intervenes. Therefore, this is a real commissioning. And the people to whom he's going to communicate the gospel is different than the people who have heard it in the past. To whom has the gospel been given pretty much to this point?
The Jews.
It's been given to Jews. And even if they're called Hellenists, Greek-speaking Jews, they're still, or former sort of recovering Gentiles. They become Jews, and that's why they're hanging around the synagogue. So the gospel's been directed towards them, but thanks to Peter, again, Peter's sort of central to a lot of this stuff, because for Luke, Peter is central. Now Cornelius, now the gospel can go to Gentiles, even if they're not Jews. Now we still have, as I said the last couple of weeks, we still have a loose end. You know, before Cornelius, there was a real question of whether the gospel could go to Gentiles who haven't become Jews. You know, in other words, to Gentiles that haven't been circumcised, that aren't obeying Jewish law, converts, whether you have to be a Jew first to be a Christian. And Cornelius tells us, established, that no, you don't have to be. You can be a Gentile, become a Christian, but we still have that loose end. Once you become a Christian, then
You have to be circumcised.
yeah, should you become a Jew? You know, even though we've eliminated the first one, the first issue, we've still got the second one. You know, is that something Gentile Christians should do? Should they accept Jesus Christ and convert to Judaism? And that's still an open question. Now, when we looked at last week, so this hasn't been resolved. It will be resolved next week. We're going to get a resolution of that next week. Because it's still an open question. Now, in what we looked at last week, we had some relatively important things occur in chapter 13 that will sort of set the stage for what's going to be coming later. What are you remember some of the things that we looked at in chapter 13 that were kind of significant? It wasn't one of those chapters that just loaded with theology and deep teaching, but there were some things that were kind of significant that we're going to be able to build on as we move forward. On whom are we focused now? Who is our focus in chapter 13?
Saul.
Okay, Paul and Barnabas. And remember when we started, it was Barnabas and Saul. And then all of a sudden in chapter 13, it becomes
Saul and Barnabas.
we got the reversal, which tells us that the priority has shifted. The leadership has changed. You know, that it's going to be Paul that's going to do it, and Barnabas is going to be a little bit secondary. And in fact, from this point on, he's not going to be called Saul anymore. He's going to be called Paul. And I told you last week that's kind of significant, because Saul is Hebrew, Paul is Latin. So we're kind of moving, which tells us where his focus is going to be. His focus is not going to be on Palestine. His focus is going to be on the other parts of the Latin Roman Empire. So that kind of, even that small name change in how Luke uses it, kind of gives us an insight into where Paul is going to be doing his work. That's going to be his focus from this point on. He also, right at the end of chapter 13, when he was in Antioch, and there are two Antiochs, so important.
I saw that. I have little maps in it.
Yeah.
I thought, well, there's one here.
Yeah, it's really important to recognize there's two Antiochs, just like there are two Sligos. Because when I post things and it asks for the address, I'll tell you on half the times I have to give an address, it'll do Ireland first. It'll give the Sligo, and it's funny, on Facebook it'll ask that, and sometimes I hit the wrong one because the one in Ireland is first. And I'll type it in if you've ever put an address in on a Facebook post, it'll give you a little map down below of the town, the location, and I'll look at that map and I don't know anything that's there. And I look up and I'm in Ireland, and so then I have to change it to here. It's sort of like that. You've got you got a bunch of Antiochs, but the big Antioch is a port. This is a smaller one, actually in a province, Galatia. So when Paul writes his Galatian letters, this is one of the churches that's included in his Galatian letter. The church this church in Antioch and Iconium and Derbe, those are all Lystra. They're all cities in Galatia. So those would be the churches to whom he's writing in the Galatian letter. Churches he's visited, because he's visiting them now. Okay, so in Antioch, though, something kind of dramatic happened. And Paul made a statement that, as a reader, we look at and say, oh, that's really interesting. What ends up happening at the end of the 13th chapter in Antioch?
I think they chased them out.
Okay, they chase them out. Who chases them out? Who is causing problem? Now, this is no shocker to us. Religious Jewish leaders are causing problems. And they stir up crowds and they chase them out. And Paul makes this dramatic statement. And what's the dramatic thing that Paul says as he's leaving, running, getting out of town? Based on how they're treated. And we know the Jewish leaders are motivated by, what's motivating the Jewish leaders? Jealousy. That's what Luke's already told us. They are jealous. And they chase him out of town, and Paul says, by George, the gospel is going to go to Gentiles. From now on, those are going to be the people that are going to hear it. Now, for us, the reader, Luke chooses to put that in there. I mean, he's shaping the story. For us, the reader, we're thinking, okay, now we're ready to start. Now we're ready to enter this phase to the ends of the earth, because that's the population that covers most of the earth. So we're ready for this to happen. Now, when we get to the beginning of chapter 14, where is he? Where are Paul and Barnabas?
Iconium?
Yeah, they're in a city called Iconium. Now, Iconium, again, if you've got your little map in there, and I printed on my little notes, little maps, so that I can see where they are. All these towns that they're going to talk about are in this little area in the province of Galatia. And so he moves from Antioch to Iconium, which is another little bitty town. And where do Paul and Barnabas go in Iconium?
Synagogue.
They go to the synagogue. Is that a shocker that he's going to a synagogue? A little bit, but not much. I mean, that's where he's been going, although he did say from now on it's going to the Gentiles. But here he's going to a synagogue, which means he is still talking to Jews, right? Some of them are Jews by birth, some of them are Jews by conversion, but he's talking to Jews, and it says he is doing what in the synagogue?
Speaking.
Okay, speaking. Now, we already know how he's speaking, because in the 13th chapter, Luke told us how he was speaking in the synagogues. So he's speaking in the same way. Now, when you look at Paul's sermons, or Saul's sermons, or for that matter, Peter's sermon, or Stephen's sermons, what seems to fill a lot of their sermon? What seems to be a big deal in the sermons we've heard so far from Peter and Stephen and Saul / Paul? They've tended to do the same thing. Do you remember what the content of their sermons generally are?
Don't they give a history or tell about Jesus?
Outstanding. They give a Jewish history, right? And then they give a Jesus history. And the Jewish history goes all the way back to Abraham and includes David, and the Jesus history is how Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the one who came to save, kind of bring this history together. We'll file that away. That's been their stump sermon. That's the sermon we've heard over and over again. And it didn't matter who's preaching it, they tended to be the same, pretty much the same. And so when he's preaching there, even in the 13th chapter he does it, we can assume that it's the same sermon because he's preaching it to Jews, and the result is pretty much the same. What happens as a result of his sermon, his preaching?
People start believing.
People start believing, right. And he's preaching in the synagogue, so when it says Jews and Greeks, we're talking about Greeks who have converted to Judaism, because they're Greeks at the synagogue, not Greeks running around in the street, but who were gathered in the synagogue to study the law. Okay, so that's typical. Nothing new and exciting there. This is what Paul has been doing. Same thing Peter's did. Same thing Stephen did. What also happens that's no shocker?
The Jews who would not believe stirred up the Gentiles and turned them against the believers.
Okay, so Jews that don't believe are stirring up the Gentiles. Now, why do you think he would call them Jews that don't believe? Why wouldn't he just call them Jews? Why do you think he'd feel the need to say the Jews that don't believe? What does that tell us?
They didn't believe in the Holy Spirit.
Well, these Jews don't believe. In whom do they not believe?
Jesus.
They don't believe in Jesus. They're not Christian. If he says these Jews that don't believe were stirring up. What does that tell us about the Jewish population in Iconium?
Large.
Okay, it's large, and some Jews do believe, right? Because you wouldn't, if it was just the Jews were against him, he'd say the Jews stirred up the Gentiles, but he has to say the Jews who didn't believe, which would suggest that there are Jews that do believe, that they do believe. Now, I think that's really important in Luke's church, for Luke to remind his church that the enemy just aren't, because you've got Jews in your church, former Jews who have accepted Jesus. And for Luke, the break with Judaism isn't dramatic like it is in the Gospel of John. We seem to have a pretty clear break. But in Luke, it's not. There are Jews that do believe in Jesus. In fact, the church hierarchy are all Jews who believe in Jesus. I mean, Peter's a Jew. Good night, Paul's a Jew. They're all Jews who believe in Jesus. So Jews aren't bad. It's the Jewish leaders and the Jews that don't believe that are causing the church problems. Okay. And so what do Paul and Barnabas, so they're facing opposition. What do Paul and Barnabas do in the face of this opposition that they're encountering?
They did miracles.
They do miracles. They preach, continue to preach the gospel, right? And how does he describe their preaching? I mean, are they timid? Are they preaching in back rooms? Are they preaching in the shadows so that the people who oppose them don't hear?
It said boldly in my book.
They are preaching boldly. Now, why is that kind of important for Luke to establish? There's no question that Paul and Barnabas are facing opposition. But in the face of opposition, what are they doing?
Facing it.
They're facing it with boldness. They aren't being timid. They're not retreating. Again, a nice lesson for Luke's church. That in the face of opposition, you can be bold. You can be bold. Now, have we seen people do that before in Luke? Sure we have. And what's been the result of people preaching boldly? Remember way back earlier. Remember? Stephen was stoned. Peter was arrested and given a slap on the wrist and turned loose. Peter was arrested and scourged. So if you do this, you can expect different kinds of, and Stephen did it and was killed. So doesn't mean if you do it, they're gonna wimp out. You may pay consequences, but they're still doing it boldly. And we'll see that in the 14th chapter that Peter is going to pay a price for preaching boldly. Okay, now what else is happening in the city, which is kind of interesting? So we've got him continuing to preach boldly and doing signs, doing miracles. What is occurring in the city as they're doing this?
They're split.
The city is split, which is kind of interesting because remember, we're not talking about a place that's Jewish. This isn't in Palestine. This isn't outside of Jerusalem. This is in Asia Minor. This is in what is now Turkey, the country of Turkey. So we're not talking about a place that's in sort of the Jewish heartland. But as Luke writes it, evidently their message is so powerfully received in Iconium, it's actually done what to the population of Iconium? It's divided the population. My gosh, dividing a city, like the city of New York is divided over between the Jews and the Christians. Lord have mercy. That's pretty dramatic. That's how Luke describes it, which means Paul and Barnabas must be incredibly successful. Now it mentions, and it's going to be a couple of times in this chapter, mentions the apostles. And I think that's interesting that they mention apostles, because I've told you that for Luke, and I think I'm right, the apostles with a capital A are limited to 12. That's why they needed to replace Judas when he was killed. And Paul is never going to be called by the apostles an apostle. But here it seems as though he is. And I think that could be one of two reasons why Luke is using apostle here. One could be that they represent the apostles, which again makes sense because in this early church, everybody's on the same page. You don't have, renegade Christians running around with different messages. They're all preaching the same message. So they're carrying the apostles' message. Or he could be using it as, remember the word apostello means to send out, sent out. He could be using it like a verb, that these are guys who have been sent out. That would be, instead of capital A apostles, little a apostles.
Some of my notes somewhere, I don't know where, said Paul could not be an apostle because he never saw Jesus.
Right. Well, that's interesting because what Paul will say, according to Luke, if we read Luke, it would appear as though the apostles are 12. That's why when they became 11, they had to get a 12th. So you got 12. And the apostles never call Paul an apostle. Paul in Acts never calls himself an apostle. He'll never say, I'm an apostle. Now in his letters though, he does. In his letters, you look at every letter he wrote, he calls himself an apostle. And what Paul will say is the basis for being an apostle is seeing Jesus Christ, And that's why he'll say that certainly the 12 were, and the disciples were, and the 200, he says, that saw Jesus. And I don't know where he gets that number, because it must be a number floating around when Paul was writing, because Paul's writing way before this. But 200 who saw Jesus after the resurrection. And then he says, and me, I am the last one to see Jesus. So I am the last apostle. And why would Paul say I am the last one to see Jesus? Damascus Road. Paul says I'm an apostle because I saw Jesus on the Damascus Road. He also will say, no one else will see Jesus ever again. I am the last one. Which is kind of interesting. Reflects a little bit of Paul's character, personality. If you want to find a confident person, you look at the Apostle Paul. He is really confident. And he has to be. He believes that what he's saying is true. And if you disagree, it's not a matter of, let's sit down and talk about it. It's, you're wrong, because this is the truth. Has to be. In the early church, you can't have a variety of ideas just floating around. So Paul does not lack self-confidence. But that's how Paul sees it. You've had to see Jesus, and he's it. He's the last one that can legitimately call himself an apostle. If you kind of use the capital A, those who are sent out, we're all sent out. So in a sense, we're all apostles in that we're all disciples. We're all disciples, we're all apostles, because we learn and we go out. So, and that's what it means in Greek. That's what the word means in Greek. So, does that make any sense? Okay, good. Because sometimes I talk and at the end, I look back on what I said and I think, I'm not sure that made any sense.
At Bible study several years ago, we had a movie. There's a movie called Paul, because we watched it in two different. Do you remember that meetings? It was very interesting.
Yeah.
The life of Paul. And it was like two. We watched that for a Bible study. Interesting, because he is an interesting.
Oh, he's a fascinating person, and in a sense, the Paul presented in Acts, I think is less interesting than the Paul presented in his letters. Because, and understand, Acts is written 60 years, well, that's 30 years after the last letter was written. At least 30 years, maybe longer, maybe 40 years. That's a long time You know, that's like 2 generations ago. And Paul becomes, I don't want to call him bland, but he has less distinctiveness in Acts. When you read his letters, geez Louise, here's a guy with whom I can really identify, because he gets mad. You know, in his letters, he really gets angry. You don't see him getting angry in Acts, but he gets angry. Read the second letter to the Corinthians, which is probably 2 letters that's been combined, because the mood changes dramatically in it. He is really ticked off with the Corinthians. He is mad at them. He's mad at the Galatians in his letter. He's really irritated with them. And I kind of like that, because, you know, sometimes you think these guys just kind of drifted above human emotion. That's not the Apostle Paul. I mean, the Apostle Paul, he'd get angry, and he'd tell people exactly what he thought. I mean, geez, he confronted Peter, according to what it says in Galatians, called Peter a hypocrite. Calling Peter a hypocrite, that takes guts. Yeah, that takes a lot of guts and gall to say, you know, you're wrong. And that's what he told Peter, face to face. You're wrong. And it also says he told that to Barnabas. And Paul says that's why they broke. That's not why they'll separate in Acts. They won't separate in Acts because of that. But Paul says in the Galatian letter, 2nd chapter of Galatians, Barnabas and I separated because Barnabas left with Peter. He was on Peter's side. So it's really, we get that impression, slightly different impression of Paul. He would have been an interesting person to talk to, but not disagree with. I think Paul would have been an interesting person to listen to, but I don't think you discussed much with Paul. I think he told you what you're supposed to believe. I think he's pretty clear on that. Okay, so they're in Iconium. You got a divided city. The Jews are stirring up the Gentiles just like they did before, but they're bold. Where do they have to go? Where does Paul and Barnabas have to go, since the city, the people in Iconium are getting stirred up?
Lystra and Derbe.
Yeah, they have to get out of town, because the rulers, and they would be Gentile, not Jewish, they're being stirred up to a point where they want to do what to them?
Stone.
To kill them, to execute them. But Luke says it's stoning, not crucifixion. And stoning is the way Jews did it. That's not the way Romans did it. So it's the Jews' fault. It's not, because remember, I think one of the things you see underlying Luke and Acts, certainly Acts, is the Romans aren't the bad guys. The Romans are the ones you turn to for protection. They aren't Christian, but they'll protect you because they're fair. The Jews are jealous. The Jewish leaders are jealous. Okay, so they have to leave town. They go to Lystra and Derbe, which is, again, 2 little places in Galatia, close. And what are they doing in those 2 places?
Preaching.
Of course they're preaching, because that's what they do, right? Now, we got a little shift in the narrative in verse 8 when he's in Lystra. What happens in Lystra?
They healed a man with a crippled feet.
They healed a man who, and what's the situation with the man and who heals him? Who is it that heals this guy? Well, ultimately God is the one who does it. But who is the human instrument?
Paul says a loud voice, stand
Paul.
up.
Right. Paul is the one that does it. So you have and what is the condition of the man? Because Luke is very specific in giving the guy's condition.
He never walked.
He never walked. He never walked. Now, guy that never walked, Paul calls out, heals him, stand on your feet, he does. Miracle, right? Demonstrating what? What does this miracle demonstrate? About Paul. For us, the reader, when we read this, what does this tell us about Paul?
He has the Holy Spirit.
He's got Holy Spirit, power. Man, he can do it. It's really interesting if we think about what he does here, healing this guy who's never walked before. Somebody else has done that in the book of Acts. Do you remember who did this earlier in Acts? Peter did it earlier. In the 3rd chapter, Peter does the exact same thing. To a person who was lame from birth, just like this guy. And so if you've got Peter doing it in the 3rd chapter, and Paul doing it in the 14th chapter, what might Luke be suggesting? What might be a little suggestion Luke is making here? If Paul is doing the same thing Peter did.
And he's just as good as a disciple.
That's it. I think that's exactly what he's saying. That Paul is carrying the mantle of the apostles. That his connection to God is just as strong as Peter. And that's important because it's going to be Paul that's going to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. He's going to be the one that's going to do it. Not Peter. He's going to be the one to do it. Okay. Yeah, I think this is Luke telling his audience, the baton has been passed to Paul. Although Peter is still going to be central. He's going to have one more important role to play in this little story, and then he's going to fade. Peter's going to disappear from the story. And Paul's going to kind of take it over. Okay, so he's done this incredible miracle. He didn't heal a person who had recently hurt his ankle. He's somebody that's never walked. He commanded. Now, faith is really important for these healings. And what? Why would faith be important? Play an important role in these healings. In other words, how does this man show faith?
He doesn't.
Well, think about it. Now think about it. Paul says he doesn't show faith in Jesus, right? No mention that the person said, "Oh, I believe in Jesus." Isn't mentioned at all. How does the person, though, show faith? Which tells us how, maybe gives us a little insight in how Luke sees faith. And it's the same way Paul sees faith. What does the guy do that shows he has faith?
It says here in this, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of man.
Okay, hold on that for just a minute. And I'm glad you moved there because we're going to be there in just a second. What does the guy healed? What does he do that shows faith? And when you think about it, every miracle we've seen performed, the person healed has done the same thing. In each case, showing faith.
Listening to him.
He listens to him and does, what else does he do?
Spreads the word.
What does it say here? Paul says to him, stand upright on your feet. And what does the man do?
Jumps up.
He jumps up. And that's the faith. He trusted in what Paul told him. Faith is responding, is a response, is a sign of trust. It's not believing stuff. It's trusting that the word you've heard is true. And that's what he does. And when you think about all the other healings we've seen, when Jesus says the same sort of thing, get up, take your pallet, which your stretcher, and leave. What does the guy do?
Jumps up and walks.
Yeah, jumps up and walks. Now, the guy could do what? That would show a lack of faith.
Just sit there.
Just sit there. I don't believe you can do that. I don't believe it. So I'm going to stay here. It's almost like the act of trust is what moves you to healing. It's the willingness to stand up and walk, as opposed to say it's not possible, it can't happen. It didn't happen. Fascinating, I think, the way the writer is portraying what faith is. You know, faith becomes trusting something you may not necessarily know for sure. Now, Ellen, as you said, he does this, right? Mm-hmm. And what do the crowds assume?
That the gods have come down.
That the gods have come down, which tells us, what about the crowds? What do we know about the crowds? If the crowds say the gods have come down,
they believe.
Now they're saying the gods have come down.
Oh.
And in particular, what gods do they assume have come down?
Probably the gods they had been worshiping.
Yeah, he names them, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. You know, what gods have come down?
Zeus and Hermes.
Zeus and Hermes. Which is kind of ironic, which tells us what about the crowds? Are the crowds Jewish? They're pagan. You know, the crowds can't be Jewish. The Jews wouldn't say the god Zeus has come down. Jews don't believe in the god Zeus. Pagans do. The pagans do. And they assume that Zeus and Hermes have come down. Now it's really interesting. Who do they assume is Zeus? And who is Zeus? What do y'all know who the god Zeus is supposed to be? How the Greeks viewed Zeus? The Romans didn't call him Zeus, they called him Jupiter. Zeus is the king of the gods. He's the boss. Zeus is the one that has the lightning bolts. He's the big guy. He's the boss. Hermes, Romans called Hermes, the Greek god Hermes, called him Mercury. Hermes was the one that had wings on his shoes because he spread messages. He was the messenger. So if Zeus had a message for somebody, he sent Hermes with the message, and Hermes with his wings on his shoes would go and convey the message that Zeus had. It's kind of interesting. Zeus among the gods is far more important than Hermes. Hermes is, like I said, he's a messenger. That's what Hermes does. They assume that Barnabas is Zeus, and Paul, the one who did the miracle, is Hermes, which makes some sense because who's been preaching? Paul. So Paul's been conveying a message, so he must be Hermes, but evidently Barnabas is the big guy, is the boss. Well, we, the reader, know that not only are they wrong in saying these two guys are gods, but they don't even get the status right. They put the one who is second now as the one on top. So these guys are a little confused, but they're pagans. They are Gentiles who aren't Jews. And in fact, what does the priest of Zeus, because evidently there's a Zeus temple close by, what does the priest of Zeus do?
Brought bulls and flowers.
He brings flowers, and he's going to perform. He's got an ox with him. He's going to kill that ox and sacrifice to these two gods. Now, understand, for the Greeks, this isn't having human beings that are sort of personifying gods. That's not radically unusual. I mean, it's pretty special, but it's not unheard of, because often gods would take human forms and hang around with humans. Zeus was big into dating. Zeus dated a lot of human women. That's how we ended up with Hercules, because Zeus was a player among people, humans. So that was something gods tended to do. They tended to take on human form to sort of hang out with people. And that's what they assume has happened, these two guys. Now, what is the reaction of now it says Barnabas and Paul, because Barnabas is the one called Zeus and Paul is the one called Hermes. What is their reaction?
They were upset.
They are really upset. And what do they say? It's not just Paul saying it, it's not Barnabas saying it, it's they say. What do they say?
Why are you doing these things?
Right. What do they want? What does Barnabas and Paul, Paul and Barnabas, what do they want this crowd to understand?
They're here to teach them to turn away from this kind of sacrificing gods.
They are human beings, and their mission is to cause them to turn away. Okay? Man alive, it looks like we're on the threshold of another sermon, right? Because this is sort of what we've seen before. And what have they already told this crowd? That they should turn away from this stuff and do what?
Turn to the living God.
Turn to the living God, okay? And who is the living God?
Jesus.
Our God. who is
Well,
on earth.
what does Paul say here? What does Luke say? Because you're entirely right. If we just read this, if I read this, I assume, who is the living God? He's the Father of Jesus Christ, right? But is that what they say? What do they say? Who is this living God?
Made heaven and earth.
The one who made the heaven and the earth and the sea. So they're saying the living God is the creator God. Now that becomes really interesting because this is a little departure, and we'll keep on. That's how he's starting his sermon. All right, let's see where he goes from there. This is a little departure because they haven't been talking about that before. They've never, in their sermons, talked about a living God who is the creator God, the creator of heaven and earth. What did this God do?
Gives you rain.
Okay, gives you rain. What else?
Food.
Allowed all nations to walk their own way.
Yeah. So, what does this say about, this is his sermon. He's preaching to these folks, right? That the living God, the creator God, cares for, has shown compassion to, or care for the pagans, right? He's the God, this God that we're here to share, is the one that gives you rain, right? Provides you with food. Now, and yet Paul calls this good news, right? He's there to preach the good news about this living God who provides rain and food for you pagans. Now, that's kind of interesting. What is Paul doing here? And we're going to see him do this same sort of thing again. What is he doing as he's preaching this good news? And let me tell you, I think this is really important. This is an important lesson for Luke's church. Even before we push it, what's kind of surprising about this sermon? What is not in this sermon that we would expect to be part of a sermon about the good news?
Jesus.
Thank you. That was in, all three of you said it at the same time. We would expect him to say something about Jesus, for crying out loud, right?
Yeah.
And in every other sermon we have seen in Acts, the preacher has also mentioned, he has certainly mentioned Jesus. What else has he mentioned?
Holy Spirit.
Holy Spirit. He's mentioned Jewish history. He's mentioned what you did to Jesus. They have mentioned that every single time. And here is Paul preaching a sermon to these pagans and never mentions Jesus, but does mention the God who creates and provides. And he calls it good news. What do you think Luke is suggesting by writing this particular sermon down for us? Because again, he's choosing what he's going to put in here. He could put anything he wants. He could just not include this. Because actually, this is a little uncomfortable. It is for me. Because this is a departure from the usual sermon. I'd expected to mention Jesus somewhere in the sermon. What is he doing that Luke wants his church to know? How is Paul conveying the good news to those pagans? That may be important for us to understand too. Isn't he speaking their language? Isn't he speaking their language? Isn't he using images that they could understand? A God that provides your rain, provides you food. Instead of saying, now sit down, take out a pen and pencil, and let me explain Jewish history to you, which you have no knowledge of. But let me explain that to you first, so that I can explain to you how Jesus is the Messiah of the Jews. So that you can now understand how Jesus, the Messiah of the Jews, is also your Messiah, which is a concept you've never had, so let me explain that to you. That's not what he does. In other words, he doesn't present the good news as something that is limited to Jews. The good news is something that even pagans that have no knowledge of what Jews believe, it's something that they can grasp too. And I think that is really powerful. Really powerful. And I'll tell you, it becomes powerful for me. Because that may mean if I'm going to convey the gospel in a world that doesn't speak church language, what might I need to do?
Speak their language.
I might need to speak their language. I had a good friend of mine when I was in Weirton, and one of the things that meant a lot to him, this was a big deal for him. He passed. He used to say, and I'm sure I've shared this with you before, he was big at Pittsburgh Seminary. Did a lot of things there. Anyway, he said, as he had done research, the Presbyterian Church was not overly successful in most parts of the world. We just weren't. I mean, we were okay. I mean, we're in there. But we weren't tremendous. And there's a lot of reasons why we struggled in a lot of places. But we were incredibly successful in Korea. Incredibly successful. In fact, I know I've mentioned it before. There are more Korean Presbyterians. There are more Presbyterians in South Korea than in the United States and Canada. There are more Korean Presbyterians than here. Presbyterian Church was incredibly successful in Korea. The Methodists weren't. And in most places, the Methodists were far more successful than Presbyterians. A lot has to do with one is far more emotional. One involves thought. Presbyterians, we tend to be thought-oriented, and Methodists are more feeling-oriented in terms of their theology. But they weren't all of that successful in Korea, and neither were the Catholics. And what he found when he did some research, and it's not something that's hidden, other people have said it too, that when the Catholics, particularly the Portuguese Catholic missionaries, came to Korea, they taught the Koreans Latin so that they could participate in the Mass, so that they could participate in God. And when the Methodists came to Korea, they taught the Koreans English so they could read their Bible, so they could sing these beautiful Methodist hymns, these wonderful Wesleyan hymns that moved the spirit. But when the Presbyterians came to Korea, they did something Presbyterians didn't do in other places. When the Presbyterians came to Korea, they learned Korean. The Presbyterians learned Korean and started to share the gospel in the language of the people, instead of having the people learn their language. And I think that's really profound. And I think that's what Luke is suggesting here. And we're going to see it again when Paul is in Athens. He will do the exact same thing, only longer. His sermon is going to be longer. What he is doing, he's not compromising Jesus Christ. He's not compromising the good news, because Luke tells us it's good news. What he's doing is he's conveying it with images and language that the people who are hearing it can understand. And that becomes, I think, that is always the challenge of Christians. How do we communicate the gospel in a world that doesn't speak our language and doesn't think in terms of our images and doesn't have our background? How do we do that? Do we expect the world to learn our language, or is it up to us to learn theirs? And that becomes really, really important. And I think that's what Luke is getting at here. And it's an important lesson for his church, because his church, again, is struggling, And maybe it's an important lesson for us as well. I know this always kind of resonates with me. When I think about the people in my life, all of them are Christian. All the people in my life are Christian. I don't know that I have any close friends that aren't in the church. So I speak church language because that's where my friends and family are. But if we're going to be successful out there, we might need to know their language. Anyway, that's what he does. He preaches this new sermon. Again, we're going to hear this again when he's in Athens. Who spoils the party? And he preaches this sermon. What's the reaction of the crowd as he preaches his sermon? Are they disappointed? Heck no. They're even more fired up to offer him. So his little sermon has stirred up the crowd. Who spoils the party?
The Jews.
Of course, the Jews come. And they're coming from these other two places that have chased him out of town, right? Well, we already know they caused trouble, and they're jealous. And what do? Now, this is pretty dramatic.
Stone Paul.
They stone Paul. Okay? And they drag him out of the city because they assume he's dead. What happens? He gets out. And the disciples surround him and he gets out. Now, this isn't a resurrection, because Luke says they assumed or supposed him to be dead. That Luke doesn't want to suggest that Paul rose from the dead. He didn't. But he was in bad shape. Okay? And so what does Paul do once they find him and bring him back into the city? Because he's not an idiot. He leaves town. This is not the place to go, and they go to Derby. And what do they do in Derby?
Preach.
The same thing. Okay? And how do they strengthen the disciples? The ones who are there, the believers who are there. Which seems really appropriate given what they just did to Paul.
You have to go through tribulations.
Don't think it's going to be easy. Because it's not. Again, really an important thing for Luke to tell his church. It's one thing to say preach boldly, but understand that a lot of people don't want to hear it. And you're going to face all kinds of opposition. And what do they do for? What do Paul and Barnabas do for the church? And this is kind of significant.
Appointed elders.
Appoint elders. Now, do any of y'all know the word elder is in English? Do you know what the Greek word for elder is? A little bit pertinent. The Greek word for elder is presbytus. Presbytus. That's the Greek word for elder. And so the Presbyterian Church is a church ruled by elders. Is a church ruled by elders. Because we have ruling elders and we have
Former elders.
teaching elders. Ruling elders and teaching elders. And that's a big deal for the Presbyterian. That's why it's called Presbyterian Church. because we are a church ruled by elders. Old Presbyterian Church never had ministers. Never had ministers of word and sacrament. They had teaching elders. It's in the Book of Order now. That's what you had. That I was ordained as a teaching elder. You were ordained as ruling elders. Because the function is different, the status is the same. But so what are they establishing? What's being established there that we haven't seen before? What is Paul and Barnabas doing as Luke is writing this history of the early church? What are they doing for the disciples? They're setting up structure. They're setting up some church structure. We saw it earlier when they appointed deacons, to do the work. We're setting up church structure. Because in Acts, the church is going to be here for a while. The church is not passing. The church is going to be around. So they start setting up some structures. And they do that. Then what do?
Fasting.
Okay, they fast, so they give them some direction on what they should be doing. After they finish there, where do they go? They head back, right? They're heading back towards the coast, right? And eventually, what do they end up doing? They go back to not one Antioch, not Antioch part 2, Antioch part 1. They go back to the bigger city, Antioch. Remember the place where Christians are called Christians. People of the way are called Christians. Okay? And what do when they get back to Antioch?
Gather the people.
Gather the people
church
together.
Told them about what all God had done
What God had done where? With whom?
with them and how he
With the
opened
Gentiles.
With the Gentiles. What they're doing with the Gentiles. And they stay with them for a while. So Paul is taking this first little missionary journey through these little towns in Galatia. But the mission is now, the word is going to the Gentiles. We've got something brand new. And we even have a template of the kind of sermon that can be given to the Gentiles. One that will resonate with them. You don't have to teach them to be Jews first to convey to them good news. Okay. Now, all of this is great, right? But we still have an issue. And what's the issue that we still have?
Circumcision.
Circumcision is an issue. Do all these Gentiles have to become,
Circumcised.
yeah, do they have to become Jews? And circumcision is the sign, but Lord have mercy, there are other signs. What are some other signs that if you're a Jew, you need to do? A male Jew needs to get circumcised, but what are some other things all Jews have to do? Have to follow dietary laws, right? Yeah. A Jew can't eat any animal with can only eat animals with hoofed animals that have a cloven hoof, but even those animals have to chew a cud. So you can't eat a horse because they don't have cloven feet. But you can't eat a pig, which does have cloven feet, but they don't chew cuds. So you got to follow Jewish law, right? Circumcision is the top one, but there's a lot of Jewish law. So as a converted Christian, are you obligated to follow the Jewish law? That's still up in the air. We'll have a resolution, but it may not be the resolution that you expect. It's an interesting resolution, what they decide to do. Okay, any questions? But we have the story advancing. We've got Gentiles now believing. We've got a template of a Gentile, a good sermon to preach to Gentiles, to reach them. We've got Paul doing the kind of miracles. And Paul was stoned, so was Stephen. So all of a sudden Paul is kind of personifying both Peter and Stephen here. We've got a connection there in terms of the story. We got this story advancing. It's not a surprise that Paul's going to play an important role, but not so much in chapter 15, and that's what we'll look at next week at 10 o'clock. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and help us, just remind us, as we share the gospel in the world around us, that we communicate it in ways that people can understand. Not everybody speaks our language or shares our perspective. Help us, without compromising what we believe, the truth of the gospel, help us to convey that truth in ways that they may understand. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Good luck this afternoon.